Hello and welcome to this lecture on early planning and functional design. My name is Gabriel Wurzer and you're hearing this lecture as part of our module Algorithmic Planning and Analysis. So what is early planning? Early planning is a twofold activity encompassing site analysis and functional planning. Roughly speaking, one can say that while functional planning tries to compose the functions on the inside of a building into a schema, the site analysis tries to determine which forces act from the outside on the site. So let's see some phase model of planning, of design. Here is a phase model introduced by the American Association or the American Institute of Architects. Here you see that there are basically three distinct activities in the early phases of planning, namely pre-design, which is everything that has to do with finding constraints, finding requirements, and so on. Then comes the phase of site analysis, where you develop and see how your site actually behaves and how the zoning regulations act on the site. And then you go to the inside of the building you're planning and try to arrange the functions you have there in a schema. Now, usually, the client doesn't act, or in our minds, the client doesn't act as an architect, right? So the client is the person or the body that commissions a building, and usually designing is sort of, in our mind, restricted to architects, but it is in fact not, because design is really something that is embedded into the organizational environment of the client. Why does the client want a new building, or a renovated building, or a change in building plans? Because things don't work out as expected, or because there is need for making space, physical space, to enclose space by form, and so on and so forth. So the client as part of this design is something I'm especially interested in my research. And this cycle that you produce architecture, you adapt architecture, is very, very, is very iterative in complex buildings, namely hospitals or airports, train stations, and so on. And there you have those plan, do, check, act cycles, where you constantly evaluate what you're doing also in your organization, see how the processes work, see whether you need to act in space, like to adapt factory halls, to adapt a hospital, to adapt your processes. And then you do this, and then you evaluate and come again to the start where you evaluate, you get sort of the requirements that you need versus the performance of what you have in your building, and you do that all again. So Toyota is very famous for applying these plan, do, check, act cycles, or as we call it, PDCA cycles, in their whole production. And that has sort of brought them a lot of stability in how they produce cars and how they deliver quality. Now, when we look at the big picture, why am I talking about the client in the first place? In the big picture, you see that we have really two parts of design. The first part is where the client, on the left side of the design brief here, the left part of the design brief is everything that comes from the client. So a client has a need for a new, let's say, factory or a new building, an adapted building, and so because, why? Because the organization demands it, or because there is some inherent need. Then internally, things start moving, so people are asked, what should we do? Like, not really going to the architect, maybe employing somebody who is an architect to sort of make a workshop, ask the right questions, make us a catalog of requirements. And this catalog of requirements, together with a lot of other documentation, then goes into a design brief. No? So the design brief really contains a very condensed version of the occupation that happens on the left side of the design brief, but it is very condensed. So what happens then? Yeah, in a competition, you as architects must unpack this information, look for inconsistencies, see how you will implement what the client meant. And of course, you suffer from this information loss because you have to do it all again. Yeah? You have to think about relationships between functions, about the context in which a building is going to be based, about the occupants of a building, about different physical aspects such as sun and shading and so on. No? So early planning is a twofold activity consisting of site analysis and functional planning. And these activities happen in fact 2 times. One time at the client side to the left of the design brief, and one time or multiple times when we are in a competition at the architecture side. And the only thing that gives this process motion is that we are getting more concrete through time. This is depicted at the very bottom of the slide where it says the form goes from left to right, meaning that at the beginning, when the client asks him or herself or itself as an organization, what should we do? Everything is very abstract. As soon as you start a competition and you hand in your preliminary designs, things get very concrete in terms of how the form is defined, and later on you're actually going to build this. So this is like the only direction which gives a structure to this whole process. No? So let's start by looking closely at site analysis. Site analysis sees a site, any site, any building site, as a set of networks, active networks intertwined in complex relationships. What does this mean? Well, you have a lot of forces acting on the site. For example, here you see a depiction of a Taipei pop music center by Studio Gang architects, where they depict what they see as being forces. Like sun and shading, you have rain, you have drainage, and so on. So this is an actual piece of hand-in documentation. So generally what you get in the design brief, which is also part of your site analysis, you get where is the site located within the greater surrounding. How far is it to the nearest airport? And so on. No? Where are we? No? And this might continue, yeah, to the location within the neighborhood. So what is the site? If the black thing here in the middle of the screen would be our site, what is the immediate context of that site? What do we have there? And here we see that for Vienna, yeah, this is the site, the chosen site, which is depicted in black, is Praterstraße number 1. It is a hotel at Schwedenplatz, which was sort of planned to be an office building first, but then they figured, no, let's just do it into a hotel, oddly enough. Let's change it into a hotel. So, and what doesn't change is the surroundings. So we have a lot of business and high-rise buildings in the surroundings, such as the Unica Tower. At the other side, we have a very, very old part of Vienna, the inner city. We have government administration situated close by. We have the Urania Planetarium. We also have the Danube Canal, separating like the old city from the second district and so on. And we also have to think about main axis of traffic, vehicular traffic. So we have the ring, but we also do have the axis towards Augarten, which goes through the old Jewish quarter, the second district. And then we also have the road towards Praterstern, the train station. Mhm. So if we look at real examples of this, we talk of more or less urban planning. No? So here we have the different modes of transport. We have individual motorized traffic, then we have pedestrian walkways, bicyclists, and so on. We have to look at those in separation so we get the flows. Flows are sort of processes over the course of a day or even longer. So we have to look at those rhythms in special detail, since sometimes they have to do something with the site function overall. Famously, there was a researcher called Kevin Lynch who made this urban planning metaphor, like look at everything that is site context. His main thing, namely in his book, The Image of the City in 1960, he said, it's not important how the geography looks like, it is how the felt geography looks like. Like, how do we internally, as being citizens of a city, how do we see a neighborhood? This is more important than how the roads are laid out. So here I think this is an example from Boston, if I'm right. So here he depicts in a very formalized way different highlights that are in the neighborhood, different viewpoints which are important, and so on. And this is not like a piece of art, this is all formalized. So he has a catalog. What does, like say, a hatched area mean? So this is like from a catalog, but the thing that he tries to depict is the feeling of a neighborhood, the felt geography. So the actual places here, which you see, are sort of a bit bigger if they're more important, and a bit smaller if they're not so important. It is a mental map. These landmarks or features that Lynch uses are typically landmarks that are highly visible. So if we again come to the example Praterstraße 1, Praterstraße 1 at the Schwedenplatz in Vienna, a couple of buildings would stand out, or a couple of views. The first view, of course, to the inner city, to the St. Stephen's Cathedral. The second view towards Praterstern, where you see high rises, and the third view towards the Danube Canal, where you have a very nice arching of the Danube Canal towards Schweden, Schottenring, sorry. So these are the main landmarks which you would have there, apart from others that are more prominent, like Unica and so on, if you want to say that this is a landmark. Yeah, this need not be formalized always. Also, it's okay to also like do it in an artistic way, of course. Here we have a purely artistic approach to context analysis. And a second thing, when we talk of views, is that we must distinguish also between views from a site to its neighborhood and from a neighborhood to the site. Why? Because usually on the right side you see the views from the neighborhood to a site. These views that come into a site happen at pedestrian level. So you cannot use a 40-meter high ladder to get a view into a site, which is a circumstance that is often used to hide certain details or make parts of a building more private. So these views into a site are on the pedestrian level, while the views from a site are not purely on the pedestrian level. As you see, when you're at Praterstraße 1, you see a sky bar there, and from the sky bar you have a beautiful view all over Vienna. So this is quite something different. So here is what I mean by this circumstance. So you have a private part in Therme Weiß, designed by architect Peter Zumthor. You have a private part where you sit outside, or there's a sauna as well, and so on. This is a spa, and this is not to be seen from above, from a pedestrian level, so you cannot look inside that. But from that side, you have an excellent view to the outside. Here also in a sauna, I guess, the relaxation area. So yeah, for the site we have not only static features which you can sort of chart, like there's a feature over there's a landmark over there, but we also have very dynamic features such as the shading, where you have in the course of the day changing light situations, also leading to regulation like the 2-hour shadow and so on. We have changing acoustics because of traffic, because of wind, and together with the wind also comes smells, odors, like especially for the Danube Canal, where we have prevailing winds from the north, and this sort of pushes back bad odors from the river Vienna, which floats past Urania. So yeah. So these are the things that are dynamic, depending on day, on the time of the day, and also depending on the season. One needs to think about these things as well. Here another real depiction from a site in Texas, like wind flow, the sun path, and acoustics. Yeah. We also have interacting systems that are coupled. For example, dynamic forces such as lighting that internally rely on a sensor. Like the street lighting network of Vienna is automated. There you have different situations depending on the time of the day, because those sensors switch the lights on, and in turn this again influences how your site looks like. When we talk, especially in the Danube Channel, we talk of scare spaces, Angsträume, a lot, because there is a very private part that goes at the pedestrian level of the canal, which is scary, and a very public part at the top. And this lighting situation is of topmost importance and helps people really win competitions. So it's not so abstract as one would think. Another lighting design thing, or dynamic lighting situation here at Virgin Spaceport in New Mexico, where you have lighting depending on the outside sun influence. Of course, this is a project by Virgin and built by Foster's and Partners. This is how it looks. Okay, so these were the features and the site and the dynamics or the statics. Other dynamics include, of course, the movement, the circulation and traffic. Features which are farther away can be reached by means of multimodal transport. The question is, what do I use from a site? Yeah, where can I go in a certain radius, or by having a certain time budget? And therefore, what will I use as means of transport? We may also depict differently circulation modes, such as the motorized individual traffic, or the public transport, or pedestrian traffic, as done here. We can also depict throughput, like how many people or how many vehicles come between two, also are traveling between nodes at certain times of the days. Since we always have this commuter traffic, things will move from the morning to the evening differently. So you have a peak at the morning where everything flows into the city, and at the evening vice versa, except at the weekends where everything flows out of the city, and so on. And then we also have directional traffic. If you consider the ring being a directional traffic, you have a total different situation because you know that you can only go in one direction, basically, there. So you need to consider traffic differently. And of course, we have traffic axes where things meet, like Praterstern, like Schwedenplatz, and so on. And this is all food for thought. Yeah, here's another landscape architecture example where even landscape architects have to closely, and especially landscape architects have to closely think about how they structure their context or their site in view of the already existing traffic. And I mean, it's no wonder that New Zealand has a very high amount of landscape architects because there everything is very much thought with this aspect in mind that you can sort of change and better the landscape when you are actually also building your infrastructure. You can sort of have at the same time a landscape project going, which is something I'm really missing here in Austria, since it is so separated. You commission a landscape architect just because or after you have set up the whole site. This is a pity. So, okay, a no-brainer really. You need to, of course, also consider zoning, yeah, pre-existing vegetation and so on, and regulations. Yeah, this is again a real zoning plan. And no, you have seen that already. Now let's come to functional planning. Functional planning, we all learned that at some point in our studies, no? Starts basically by naming functions, then putting them into relationships, and then producing a schema. But the literature doesn't quite agree on the whole derivation. So I thought I'll just give you an overview of the whole thing, which is really thought through and lets you derive functions in a straightforward manner. So at the whole functional design thing basically comes from World War II or even before, where, or I think I will talk about that in a slide. But the main thing about it is that you first have activities. You look at a process, a work process typically, and then you have those activities that are performed in a workplace. If those activities are co-located in some, let's say, space, then you give that space a name or a function. So this is the second step, like from activities to function. And then, since you have now a couple of spaces, you want to relate them to say which space should be close to another space, which space should be dislocated from another space. Let's say the toilet and the kitchen should be, I don't know, dislocated, or are they co-located? I don't know. Yeah? In this example, I've got dining, sleeping, and cooking as main functions, and sleeping and cooking should be far away. So we have this red relationship between both. And cooking and dining should be close, so we should have a green relationship. I can write that as a matrix, as a half matrix, because it's obviously the same, the relationship between dining and cooking. If I would draw a full matrix, I would fill in the same relationships twice. So I'm doing this half matrix. You need to sort of do that maybe on paper, to write a half matrix once and to sort of to get used to that. But we also have another way in which to write it, namely between every two functions, just make, like, let's have a zoning graph, or let's have a bubble diagram, it's called, where every function is a bubble, yeah, and between each two bubbles you put a line and give that line the color that either says it should be close or adjacent, green color, or it should be dislocated or far away, red color. And if there is no relationship between two functions, let's say between, here in the example, dining and sleeping, let's just leave the line out. So, of course, this is a graph. This is what you learned also in, I guess, Richard's lecture. No? Now, it turns out that those functions, again, can be, if they are like deemed to be close, then it could be that those functions are co-located. And this means that they could physically be built in a single room or in a single space. And therefore, I have drawn around dining and cooking a dashed line, meaning that those two belong together and could also be built together. So I'm putting those both into a single zone. And in the next image to the right, you see a schema where dining and cooking have sort of entered one common zone. Yeah, this is a zone, the rectangle around dining and cooking. So putting two functions into the same zone because they're attracted to each other or adjacent is called zoning. And every function that, you know, is by itself has also its own zone. So sleeping ends up in its own zone. So when you have those zones and you locate them, like if you are gluing post-its on a whiteboard, yeah, you have also an additional element that you can sort of say where the main circulation is. This is this arrow under the schema, yeah. There is an arrow going from north to south. This is the main circulation. And then you also say, where are the entrances? Yeah? You can say this in a schema. And the schema is like a very, very preliminary, it's not the floor plan, it's like a 2D decomposition of different zones in your building. Okay, let's go back to the origins, really, of this functional planning method. So in 1910, scientific management was invented. This is Taylorism. Yeah. So Taylor invented scientific management, which means that you measure workflows and record activities on paper. You say, how long does every step I need to produce a certain product take? What is the sequence of activities? Who does what? Could we make the process better if we let everybody just do one specific part of the work process? Or could we, or introduce, like you see in the picture, like everybody has their own place in the process chain and does only one specific step. Yeah, but however, everybody could be, trained quickly for this specific step, and you can change workflows quite easily. So you have a lot of untrained labor as opposed to the people that have to plan these processes, which are, of course, highly trained. So Taylorism is also the mindset where you divide between planning, yeah, people that actually do the hard work of thinking, which is called planning or management, and the poor guys who do the actual work, which is just work. Yeah, you can. So the origins of management comes from this. Yeah, 1910 Taylorism. And as soon as 1913, an early adopter named Christine Frederick built a kitchen based on those principles of recording work processes, restructuring work processes so they become more efficient, and coming up with an optimized design. On the left, you see a kitchen as it was before, before she recorded the different work activities and rearranged them. And also on the right, you see a both rearranged process as well as a rearranged spatial layout based on that new process. And this was long before we had the Schütte-Lihotzky kitchen, Frankfurt kitchen, which was in 1926, which she also developed based on these principles, but by looking at train kitchens as most efficient form that had evolved since long, and which she sort of copied and put into housing as part of the furniture. So you paid your rent, and as part of that rent, you rented a kitchen with it, which was something enormous for the people at that time. Okay, let's look at the depiction a bit, at the depiction of the different steps that I said before, like how are activities depicted in literature. So we have a couple of standard literature works, namely Neufert's Architektsdata, Bauentwurfslehre. Then there is White, Space Adjacency Analysis. Schönfeld's Gebäudelehre also comes into place. Neufert actually starts with requirements in the form of room allocation programs. So there's nothing like there's just functions and how many square meters do they have. So he doesn't go into activities at all. White doesn't depict activities also. It's a standard way of sort of talking about activities, namely recording them on paper. Yeah, and those activities then, yeah, they are just written as, for example, sitting, reading, telephone, eating, and so on. Schönfeld, however, records these activities just as we do today in software engineering, maybe. You have an actor in the middle, and this actor performs a couple of activities depicted as circles. Now you can have dependencies between those activities. So if I want to, I don't know, eat, I have to cook first, and so this is everything. This is all already done by Schönfeld in his Gebäudelehre. Also, he puts those activities in a temporal order. So first I do this, then I do that. So very, very graphically. The second step, the function, was okay. The very term function comes from like the 17th century, or more or less, or the 18th century more, where Lodroli stated that every component of a building should have its proper, how to say, its proper function, really, officio, Zweck. And from this thought on, people became aware that they needed to strip what they designed to just uncover what the main thing is that they are designing. Yeah, what is it for? The main thing. Yeah, leading up until to Sullivan, who said that form ever follows function, which was becoming, which is famous, but he meant it, I think, in a very different context. He talked about the organic, and the organic is sort of nature wants pure function as opposed to a Baroque non-functionalist, how to say, non-utilitarian design. Yeah? So Sullivan claimed that it's more natural to sort of clearly have like functions that stand on their own. And the form should follow this, nature's intent. So how do we actually come from activities to functions? How can we look at the process and then come to the realization, hey, look, there are two activities that occur in one space? Well, by thinking more or less, yeah. And the second thing is that we just simplify and reformulate things that are done in a process in order to say, so a process is concerned with the sequence of activities, so it is something to do with time. But functions have something to do with space, so with where does it happen. And if multiple consecutive things always happen in the same space, then obviously we have something where it happens, and this we need to find a name for. Let's say we have a kitchen where you can cook and you can also eat. So I don't know how is this called, a Wohnküche, a living kitchen. Then you will, and you look at the process, and there is dining and there is cooking, and so you sort of could now have two functions, namely kitchen and dining room, or you just give it one function and call it I don't know, fancy kitchen, living kitchen, or whatever. Yeah, it depends on this translation. Yeah, how functions get how you get to functions, more or less. Um, the next thing in literature. So you have relationships between functions. And in literature, you find more or less everything. In Neufert, you find full matrices depicting the relationship of cooperation between different functions. And he sort of does that, for example, for whole hospital units. The surgical units regularly cooperates with uh, the the emergency department, while they don't, or they just occasionally cooperate with the, I don't know, psychiatry. Yeah. So they have everything there, like arranging from a full matrix to a half matrix. In white, uh, usually a half matrix is being used to state the relationships, the desired relationships between two functions, namely, should they be close or should they be far, or is it neutral? Yeah. Also, white structures the matrices or substructures them into departments. So you might have two departments that internally are composed of a couple of functions, and regardless of these departments, you can say something about the functions between each other, but you can also say to which department does a function belong. The same goes for Schoenfeld's Gebäudelehre, where he names these two functions, yeah, on a bigger level, functional areas, so are spatially connected. Yeah, they are like they are touching wall to wall, or they are adjacent, or we don't know. Yeah. They are adjacent would mean they touch uh, in a wall, and spatially connected would be they are in the common zone. Okay, other forms of diagrams. Step 4, bubble diagrams. So these graphs I talked about, like you have functions, you have relationship between the functions. Here you see it. So some people like Neufert use those or misuse those bubble diagrams also to show flows between the functions. Like so and so many patients go from this area to this area usually. Yeah? So usage frequencies. In white, you have just the relationships, yeah, depicted as lines. This is what I was showing in my diagram. And in Schoenfeld's Gebäudelehre, you have directed relationships where it could be that a function, yeah, so like is dependent or interacts with another function, but not the other way around. So this relationship is directed. Yo. Next thing. So when we are having this bubble diagram, I said we can put two functions into a common zone. And this zoning, yeah, leads to a zoned bubble diagram where we put a dashed line around things that belong together or should be built together. or should be in the same zone. In Neufert, you regularly see this, yeah, in whatever depiction. So like here we have the example. This is a school, I guess, and here you have like a round zone drawn around things that belong together. And in white, we have arbitrary, also overlapping zones. And in Schönfeld, we have strictly like we have conceptual zones, which are like depicted by dashed or dotted lines. And we have real zones that will be made into buildings or rooms that are drawn as a solid enclosure. Okay, and now after having those zones, you add a circulation and then you are in the schema. There are many ways of depicting schemata. Here are some examples. Neufert uses, like always, there is this metaphor of a zone is depicted by a square or a rectangle. Yeah? And Neufert also gives us like a conceptual zones within zones. Zones, like here on the right side of the first upper graphic, you see that there is a dashed line around 3 functions. So these are conceptually within one department. But if you look at the bottom of that graphic, you will see a function that is shared between 2 other zones. Yeah, so it overlaps. And so this is a shared function belonging to both. And in between those zones, yeah, in between both zones, you have traffic. So going from A to B, here are the flows. And also, Neufert in the graphic that is below depicts us where are the entrances, where are the exits. So how do I enter this whole building concept? In white, you have very simply a circulation network in which also and some zones. Hardly ever does he have entrances, or he just doesn't depict them. And in Schönfeld is just like in Neufert, more or less. We also can do this in 3D, of course, which is given, for example, in Neufert and in Schönfeld. However, this is already crossing the line between very abstract and preliminary plan and real plan, since you need to somehow decompose the building already into vertical levels. I wonder whether you can do that in that instance, or whether there was a plan and they simplified that plan back into a schema for sake of readability or wayfinding. Okay, and if you have found your schema and you have located your zones, you can do some assumptions like how big does a specific zone need to be if I have certain furniture to bring in there, and so on and so forth, and certain norms, and then you can really write I need something here like a space allocation program. I need 3 times that type of zone or that type of function, and each time I need it, please give it so and so many square meters. Yeah. So this is the usual thing that enters a competition, which you get as a requirement. And now let's look at, if we talk about competitions, how many competitions actually have those things I talked about, site analysis and functional design. So what I did do was back in 2013, I took every entry from beginning 2005, yeah, from the architecture chamber. They had so every entry in their database of competitions, and downloaded the competition documents, or at least the brief, the short description. And in these, I looked for I looked for the media I was just talking about. And so I let a program automatically extract all the graphics in these briefs, so as to categorize them. What is that for as a medium? So this was a very shallow search. So just by comparison or just by categorization, what do I find here? Or I read the whole brief. This was done for far lesser cases, so in less of the cases. So but how did I do the first thing, like with the categorization? Let's say I've extracted a lot of graphics from individual design briefs, and then I was asked by my own program, what do you see here? I see a site location. Yeah, and for example, this was one real example from a brief. I also saw some static features and so on. Well, do they give you dynamic forces? Yes, they do. They also give you in those briefs like acoustics and so on. Legal things you find in those, and even functions. This is a jail. Yeah. And maybe some form of bubble diagram. Here's the Angewandte. They rebuilt some studios and gave this kind of bubble diagram as a requirement. Schemas, yeah, mostly translated back from the actual existing structure or building they have there, back into a very simplified schema. So this is what I found. So in total, I found that you had always, more or less always, a spatial program. I mean, in the shallow analysis, you couldn't find that, of course, because it's no graphics. It's a table. Huh? So in 10% of the cases I reviewed shallowly, I found that they had something like this. But when you read the whole brief, then you come to the realization in 58% of the cases that they do offer a space allocation program. And even if I had sort of looked deeper, I would have found that almost always they would have had a space allocation program. The only exception would be for städtebauliche Wettbewerbe, or for art, or for urban urban situations, and so on. Yes. The second thing, like schemata, were hardly present. Zoning diagrams, bubble diagrams as well, relationship diagrams, hardly ever. It seems that architects need to know the relationships of functions always. Even functions were not present. It was always the space allocation program which had zones in it. And nobody used activities, because simply this is not, it seems this is not economy or business organization, so, but architects deal with functions or zones. Yeah, this seems to be the case. These were the functional diagramming media. The static, the site of diagrams, there you had a lot of legal, almost like a third had like legal documentation already printed in the design brief. So like what are the zoning regulations and so on. And the rest you would have probably have gone to the official sources of the county and looked at it. Dynamic forces were hard to find. Nobody really, also very little people used to give sound or acoustics as a formal requirement. And then only when you build like close to the train. Yeah. Static features were present in almost all, or like in almost all, in half of the cases I looked at deeply, where they just introduced the building in question by naming what is close nearby, what the historical meaning of whatever it is, and how does it look like in the close neighborhood. And very often, the most predominant feature was that you always had some location. Location within the city. Where is your spot within the city? So I had in total an analysis of, let's say, 653 plus 224 design briefs done either by shallowly or deeply, but the total amount of competitions I downloaded was 10,172 between 2006 and 12. And there I could also scrape the amount of competition money won. And it turns out that architects are working approximately 2 or 3 months on a competition entry using 2 persons average, and earn for these 2 months with 2 persons, or 2 or 3 months with 2 persons, they earn, if we average the money, the prize money, they earn 7,347 euro per contribution on average. Which means this is almost nothing. No? So that's the reality. Okay, we discussed now functions, we discussed site analysis. Let's discuss the whole mindset. Of course, functionalists are people who are planners. So this means they say what is, and if you don't follow it, well, then it's your problem, right? And Jan Michel formulated this like as follows. The functionalist notion of function operated as a carte blanche. Having been empty, the notion made the architects and designers free to define it in ways that always legitimize their own aesthetic priorities. So he also says what the function of being a functionalist is to just get your point across, your aesthetics. Okay, there is some work on trying to overcome this carte blanche way of putting functions on a schema or just specifying functions just because. It is, of course, the link between processes, which I call action, and functions, which I call capability of a space, that sort of constrains both. And if you're interested in how we can base functions strongly about on a process, and base processes strongly about on functions, then you're welcome to read the publication I've linked in this slide. Of course, we have, if you're talking about functions, we are not talking about a flat system of functions, but everything is composed out of higher order functions, lower order functions on. We have hierarchies of problems. Like you have a functional area consisting of different workplaces on which different functions are executed. And the structuring is in itself a problem. How do you structure? How do you give a degree of detail? And this structuring was made famous, or this how you structure design problems at all, divide them into different isolated subsets. Yeah, this was the work of Christopher Alexander in 1964, when he wrote Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and he worked on problem decomposition. He said, at the very beginning, at the top here, you have like one set. You have one giant problem which contains like a lot of issues that are all interconnected. So you try to separate them into 2 classes, and it gets easier. You separate further until you end up at the base level, at the leaves of this tree, in which everything you have there consists only of one problem, and one problem alone. Yeah, so you have problems in isolation, and these you can solve. Often those solve themselves already. And then you go up the tree again, and you have the different individual solutions that you have now to put together, yeah, to sort of to make a synthesis. Yeah, this is the synthesis of form. Like you have to, the whole is more than the sum of parts. You have to accommodate every solution together again. And then you go up the tree again until you have solved the whole tree. So he says problems need to be destructured top down, and solutions need to be synthesized bottom up. Sorry. So Alexander said, when he was accused of composing things strictly into hierarchies, that he is not doing that. He allows for overlaps. So a tree would be depicted left. So you have like problem number one, the problem at the, or no, I'm sorry, you have at the top, you have problems 1, 2, and 3, which are sort of still connected, yeah. And so a client tells you a lot of things, and those are all not separated. So you separate it in the next level into problems 1, into problems 2 and 3, and then you separate 2 and 3 again into problem 2 and problem 3. So this is the image on the left. And spatially you could see it as 1, 2, and 3 are everything, yeah. So like the form surrounding everything, and then you decompose into something that is 1 and something that is not 1, meaning it's 2 and 3. And then you decompose 2 and 3, yeah, like into problem 2 and problem 3 spatially, yeah. So this is a strict hierarchy. And this is really bad because usually you have overlaps, yeah. You should allow for overlaps. So sharing, for example, you could say there is problems 1, 2, 3 on the right side, and you have like a problem complex consisting of 1 and 2, and another problem complex consisting of 2 and 3, and of course you can see 2 in isolation, yeah, also. But when you propagate the solution back up, the semi-lattice in that case, you need to apply it 2 times, yeah, in 1 and 2 and in 2 and 3. And this is called semi-lattice. It's a very, very, very old discussion spatial planners and architects have when they are more in the direction of mathematics. Also, it begs the question, when you're dealing with functions, how fine do you get? Yeah? How fine do you get? Do I need to describe every mini function, or is it enough to just say here are 2 units, so considered as functions, like there is this surgical department which is a function on a very coarse level, and there is the emergency department which is a function, and let's talk about this at this level. Or shall I say, I don't know, lab is a function, and surgery is a function, and so on. And here is previous work was done by Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Russell says, so there is no absolute simple, né? So that you cannot go and reach a level where you reach the atomist, the atom, the thing out of which everything is made. You cannot reach that. Simple must not be taken in an absolute sense. Simpler would be a better word. You go and split a problem, let's say the hospital, you split that into several units, like the surgical department and the emergency department, and if that is enough, it's enough, it's cool. Né? If not, you go further. Yeah? You split into different zones within each department, different workplaces within that, and so on. And Russell says, of course I should be glad to reach the absolute simple, but I do not believe that this is within human capacity, and I must add also within the time we have for planning. And Ludwig Wittgenstein adds to this discussion the fact that the ultimate metaphysical simple level is either nonsensical in the sense of the German word unsinnig, this doesn't make sense because it's not it has no utility, or senseless because you ain't gonna reach it, which is sinnlos in German. Okay, sharing of functions. I think I will skip that. And that was all with this lecture. Thank you for listening. And sorry, I've got some kind of cold, but I hear that people who have a cold, at least, are in very limited cases affected by Corona. Schnupfen selten.